The Academy's Critical Studies program is an important piece of our academic program. Each semester, we bring a visiting Critical Studies Fellow to be in residence at the Academy. Selected for their perspectives on contemporary theory and culture studies, the visiting fellows present public lectures, conduct student discussion groups, and serve as an active presence in studio critiques and reviews. The visiting fellows are chosen each year to reflect the most current intellectual discourse within contemporary architecture, art, and design. This year, we are pleased that John Corso Esquivel has returned for the entire academic year as a Critical Studies Fellow. John is a tenured Associate Professor of Art History at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. He holds a Ph.D. in the History of Art and Archaeology from Cornell University, master's degrees in art history from Cornell and Tufts, a Master of Fine Arts from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts, and a bachelor's degree in art from Williams College. John examines political dynamics within a wide range of contemporary art and visual culture. His essays have appeared in the Bulletin of the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Brooklyn Rail, BE Magazine, Art 21 Magazine, Mosaic, Ricard, the Canadian Art Review, Art Papers, and numerous exhibition catalogs. He has contributed exhibition and book reviews to studies in Latin American popular culture, criticism, art in America, the Huffington Post, Art Papers, and Hyperallergic. This fall, John will complete his book project, New Subjectivities in Fiber Art and Craft, Shadows of Effect, under contract with Routledge. Please join me in welcoming John Corso to present his lecture, Diagrammatic Operations in Gego's Reticularia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. Before I started, I just wanted to mark the moment right now because I feel that we're in a state of national mourning for 11 lives that we lost in Pittsburgh and for 2 lives that we lost in Kentucky and all of the lives that have been hurt and impacted by white supremacist nationalism. It's important for us to reflect on that, to pay homage to those lives. And so I'm not in the habit of dedicating talks, but I did want to dedicate this talk to artists and designers and architects and creative people who use their practice to forge connections the way that I think Gego's work forges connections. We need your work more now than in many, many years today. So thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be able to read this last piece of my chapter that I'm about to hand into the publisher next week. It's going to be a great day when I get that off, and I'll have a little celebration. I wanted to let you know that I did change a little bit the title. I was going to talk about the Matrixial, and it's one of those cases where when you start an essay, sometimes it ends up in a place that you didn't intend. So I'll give you a little teaser on that at the very end, but I'm actually going to be talking about diagrams today. And I wanted to start, even though it's not, this is really, I'm reading from my writing rather than giving a lesson. I did want to give you a few vocabulary words that I'm going to be talking with. I'll define a few of them several times, one of them being the diagram, and that one I'm going to use a few different ways. The diagram we'll see is a Deleuzian term that's not really about a kind of diagram that you would look at, though it can be. I'm going to talk about the word molecularized to mean breaking things down that are like larger categories into their smaller constituents. Kineticism is a movement that was popular in Venezuela, Argentina, and Latin America. It's basically kinetic art that was very important in Latin American modernism. I'll talk a little bit about radical empiricism, and that's, I think, the easy way of talking about that is I'm really interested in empirical, maybe like a phenomenology without language. So prior to using language to talk about our experience. I'll definitely be talking about the rhizome, that kind of lateral root structure, as opposed to the arboreal, which describes tree structures. I'll talk a little bit about pragmatics, and this is an interesting linguistic idea. It comes from linguistics, but Deleuze uses it to talk about signs, that signs don't really get their meaning from the structure of the sign. They actually get their meaning from the use, and he calls that use pragmatics. I'll talk a lot about stratification, and stratification he describes using a metaphor, the metaphor of sedimentary rock. So if you think back to 3rd and 4th grade when you're looking at the kinds of rock, sedimentary rock is that rock that forms in rivers and oceans where lots of little pebbles get sorted by the river, and then heat or pressure or both kind of compact them into a single substance. So we'll talk a little bit about those two articulations there, and these are the people that I'm talking about. And the Matrixial, I will just give you a little hint at the end. This is a psychoanalytic theory by the Israeli-French psychoanalyst Bracha Etanger, and this has to do with a kind of a subject formation outside of the phallus, and she uses the matrix. And the matrix actually has its etymology in the uterus, so we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean at the very end. Okay. Basically, my talk is asking 3 questions. The first one is, what are the Reticularea? And this is going to be the most R I've had to use in months, so I'll do my best. What are the Reticularea and how do they work? What is a diagram and how does it work? And then if I put those 2 ideas together, what happens if we interpret the Reticularea diagrammatically? And that's basically what this talk comes down to. So with that, we're going to take a look here. This is Gego. She's mounting one of her Reticularia in a gallery in Caracas in the National Gallery. Okay. This paper looks at how affect theory treats space in the work of Gego, which is the professional portmanteau of Gertrude Louise Goldschmidt. Gego's wire sculptures hang like constellations, and she uses lines and networks to deterritorialize space so that social networks, rather than geographic borders, constitute place. I consider the scholarship of Mónica Amor to be central to this conversation. Amor offers compelling, fastidiously researched criticism showing that Gego's Reticularia keenly reference social spheres of marginalized and under-resourced people, particularly in Caracas in Venezuela. Though Amor and other scholars consider Gego's work within explicitly Deleuzian frameworks, I aim to imply a more sustained Deleuzian analysis of Gego's Reticularia than is currently available in the literature. Using Manuel de Landa's interpretation of Deleuze and Guattari's diagram, I join Amor's political analysis of Gego's work with the social and affective machinery associated with the Deleuzian diagram, what I will later describe as a social machine that sorts groups of art viewers in changing configurations. Gego benefits from an intense interest in critical and art historical research shared by few other Latin American women of her generation. Art historian and curator Mónica Amor's recent dissertation at CUNY marks a milestone in the literature on Gego's work, and the criticism surrounding it, offering some of the most well-researched cutting criticism that is available in either Spanish or English, is among the most important. In her book reviews, Amor problematizes not only specific approaches to Gego's work, but discursive biases that tend to dog approaches to Latin American art by scholars and critics in the United States. In one review, Amor cautions that an American scholar approaching Gego's work from a post-structural perspective echoes, quote, a host of international critics who have paid little attention to the local or contemporary reception of the work, raising in passing questions about amnesia and obliteration in the canonization of non-canonical figures and in their concomitant cultural and geographical contexts, end quote. Amor has documented her experience as a scholar being cornered into a discourse on Latin American art history, largely imposed by a US audience. She writes, quote, I'm often asked to discuss in panels, in symposia, roundtables, and catalogs Latin American art and its relationship to our epical mottos, multiculturalism, post-colonialism, diaspora, and of course, globalization. However, I am never asked to discuss the work of a particular artist or a specific group of works, much less to consider the parallels and differences between, for example, post-minimalism and neo-concrete art, end quote. So there seems to be a tension between, on the one hand, the tendency in the United States to impose Euro-American critical lenses onto Latin American art history without considering its unique local contexts, and on the other hand, the positioning of Latin American art as exotic other, rarely allowed to converse with Euro-American movements and theories. I myself hope to embrace an approach of mestizaje that mixes and hybridizes these approaches. And this, as an aside, kind of parallels my own lived experience as a US scholar of mestizo, Panamanian, and Italian-American heritage. In this hybrid manner, I follow Amor's historiographic lead when she writes that she prefers an architectonic reading of Gego's work that, quote, neither excludes a nomadic reading nor allies itself with the national, end quote. I will rely on Amor's scholarship to underscore the historical context of Gego's work, while insisting that her response to these politics partly follows a strategy of dissolution that I will refer to as molecularization. Ultimately, to think local dissolves certain categories into the micro-local, to forms of space that precede the borders established by the state. Venezuelan art historian and poet and now a curator of Latin American art at the Museum of Modern Art, Luis Pérez Oramas, characterizes the climate of post-war Venezuelan art, in which Gego worked as one that was ripe for a unique approach that joined the temporality of poetry with traditional visual art. He leans heavily on Derrida, and Pérez Oramas argues that Gego's work demonstrates an interest in movement and temporality similar to that of kineticism or kinetic sculpture. But while kineticism had a larger preoccupation with the cosmopolitan narratives entrenched in Venezuela's self-conscious program of modernization and internationalization, narratives that heavily conditioned its discursive reception, Gego's work, he says, does not depend on codes, nor on textualities, nor on readings. As I hope to show, this quote provides strong support for interpreting Gego's oeuvre in the Deleuzian language of radical empiricism. So here is one of the Reticulárea, first made in 1969, and it was restaged, and this is the Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas. One of Gego's most celebrated works, the Reticulárea, insists on an art-going experience that simultaneously operates below a semiotic textual level while bringing in the effective experience of social relationships that have a political and ethical repercussion. The Reticulárea, first installed publicly at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Caracas in 1969, consisted of wire webs hung throughout the exhibition space. The title suggests overlaps in the concepts of meshes, grids, and networks, that's the reticula, and areas, which is the area. In this installation, hundreds of wire networks are suspended in an otherwise uncluttered gallery. Wire segments of varying lengths connected at loop nodes to form an immersive meshwork that texture the atmosphere of the room. Visitors could walk through the space to catch closer glimpses of the work. Some areas form regular, geographically affixed nets of isosceles triangular grids. Elsewhere, the segment lengths were of sufficient diversity to create a more irregular geometry. The works resemble visualizations of networks, and from a distance even evoke molecular models, constellations, and different types of wire-form maps. Gego leveraged her engineering background for the piece, which she assembled according to an extensive series of documents, including photographs, detailed checklists, and sketches. The most compelling critical literature on the work highlights its groundbreaking challenges to sculptural paradigms. Pérez Oramas, for instance, uses lyrical language describing it as a rhizomatic artwork without a center that, quote, invaded the museum. He also describes the work in viral terms, explaining that the constantly mutating form, quote, spread itself throughout other spaces of the museum until it converted a generic and indifferent space into a defined space, end quote. Thus, the rhizomatic form serves several destabilizing functions. First, it decenters the work, reversing standard paradigms of sculpture as a centrally located object. Second, it suggests that the discrete borders of the gallery are in fact porous and subject to contamination. Finally, it offers an institutional critique through which Gego converts the discursively demarcated exhibition space of the modern Venezuelan museum into a specific and empirical space. If museum spaces privilege hierarchies of display, then any attempt to dislodge those hierarchies would in effect constitute a challenge to the power of museums to establish their authorized art canons. According to Pérez Oramas, Gego's sculptures do just that. They counteract hierarchies with the lateral, anti-hierarchical structure of the rhizome. Pérez Oramas describes two of the operations at work in the Reticulárea as, quote, an illusion of the center and an accentuation of the edge as a suspension, and both of these originating from an originating nexus, end quote. The nexus in this case is not so much an origin or a central location from which viewers can connect, but rather a moment of emergence. Pérez Oramas incisively notes that these operations do not invert a binary relationship between edge and the center. Rather, the Reticulárea replicates without the ability or desire for arboreal hierarchy. Pérez Oramas interprets this anti-hierarchical gesture as bringing the so-called neutral into the museum. He enumerates instances of neutrality, which include, quote, the structural neutrality of its knots, the theatrical neutrality of the space in which it is shown, the political neutrality of a work whose decompensating presence does not propose to boast of any privileged form of modernity, nor to be the embodiment of the vanguard of parody of the other, end quote. But I would argue that even though the Reticulárea does not participate in a dialectic challenge to hierarchical order, its effects certainly hold influential repercussions for structure, for the establishment of space, politics, and a critique of modernity. More importantly, the radical empiricism that Pérez Oramas appears to condone constitutes nothing less than a radical reconfiguration of subjectivity itself. Great studio shot. I love this. While Pérez Oramas sees the Reticulárea as having a potential for institutional critique, other critics have pursued more stereotypical characterizations. Some critics, for instance, have argued for the Reticulárea's anti-technological stance, while others have characterized what they tend to perceive as the work's femininity. The late Venezuelan curator and critic Iris Peruga, for instance, writes, quote, constructed by hand, through artisanship with wires and some tubes of diverse types, lengths, and thicknesses, which at times appear bent and even tangled up in apparent disorder, Reticulárea is not a technological work. It reveals the trace of the hand, end quote. Peruga is one of the few critics to draw attention to the hand in Gego's work. I agree that the presence of craft draws out a valid, historically feminist position, particularly since wire usually has an industrial or technological application. Like Falkenstein that I talked about last spring, Gego's choice of hand-wrought wire indicates a marked lack of interest in the machine-made aesthetics that influence both Venezuelan and international modern art movements. But I definitely differ from Peruga in contrasting handcraft to the technological. There seems no indication in this work that handmade forms cannot also speak to technology, information, and network theory while simultaneously grounding those abstract concepts in real materiality. A repercussion in maintaining a technological handmade binary manifests as the dubious propensity among some critics to read Gego's Reticulárea as feminine. One account genders the Reticulárea according to the most stereotypical cliches, quote, masculine in their constructive utopian elements and grandiose projections, they nevertheless reveal an element of feminine gracefulness and vulnerability, end quote. Thank you. I appreciate that. Another described the Reticulárea as possessing a feminine serenity, an unfortunate characterization that seems like a vestigial remnant from an earlier generation of especially male art historians. While Gego maintains a rigorous interest in engineering, architecture, and physics, criticism of her work occasionally regenders those interests, deploying stereotypically feminized discourse to highlight the work's delicateness. Instead, I would argue that we should shift back to the discussion that Amor launches in her article that appeared in the journal October, in which she interprets Gego's program as a rigorous critique of, quote, architectural enclosure and sculptural monumentality, end quote. This is another view. This one is at the Museo de Bellas Artes. I concur with Amor, who positions Gego's process of making the Reticulárea as itself a critique of Venezuelan geometric abstraction, focusing on Gego's refusal of the conventions of sculpture like mass, volume, and scale, as well as her rejection of 90-degree grids in favor of isosceles and irregular triangular grids. Amor cites Gego's process of weaving and notes that Gego used this term, which, she argues, enters Gego's production into a discourse of constructive ethics that typified most Venezuelan art of the late 1960s. She further argues that the Reticulárea, quote, in its attack on form and architectural demarcation, went against the grain of standard sculptural bodies, delimited, contained, and massive, to engage marginal spaces, such as the peripheries of rooms that she was at pains to activate in her installations, and to symbolically respond to the repressed borderline sites occupied by the shanty towns of Caracas, end quote. Amor carefully intertwines both social and neoformal analysis to show Gego's interest in both challenging modernism's paradigmatic treatment of sculpture, while also attending to local socioeconomic and political conditions. I have noted in another article that critics, particularly critics and historians who operate within the United States, tend to sanitize the political concerns out of Latin American post-war art in favor of neoformal, structural, and post-structural approaches. Amor, therefore, offers a much-needed historiographic critique that demands methodological attention to the ways that Venezuelan art participates in both local and international discourses, social and neoformal debates simultaneously. Gego's attention to both abstract form and specific place allow Amor to correlate the Reticulárea's ability to disrupt the homogeneous quality of space organized according to Cartesian coordinates with a socio-political critique that brings together space, place, and politics. According to Amor, the Reticulárea, quote, wove together the margins of the room, celebrating an in-betweenness that attested to the connective impulse of the work, end quote. Amor argues that by reconfiguring the margins of the gallery, Gego analogously references socioeconomic margins of Caracas, namely the residents of Caracas's vast shantytowns. The challenge to centrally located sculpture thus offers a parallel challenge to hierarchical social and class structures. Amor presents evidence for her political claim, including the fact that Gego's training in architecture and planning certainly made her sensitive to the economically stratified urban conditions of Caracas. Unlike New York-centered art criticism, which through the legacy of Greenberg has sought to depoliticize abstraction, Amor overcomes the either-or thinking that predominated late modern U.S. art criticism. She suggests that far from the Kantian ideal of disinterested aesthetic judgment, Gego's immersive installations trigger aesthetic experiences that attune artgoers to the peripheries. The affective experience that causes artgoers to behold new pathways through the modernist gallery instigates a parallel experience by which artgoers, upon leaving the museum, might re-territorialize, or at least in hindsight, reconceptualize their spatial relationships to the city and its residents. Some of the performative, physical relationships artgoers forge with the Reticulárea are documented in installation shots. Amor notes how important people are in these photographs. In a series by Paolo Gasparini taken at the Museo de Bellas Artes, and this is one of them, long shots and the occasional mid-shot carefully frame human bodies so that the background of meshes continuously engulf their silhouettes. The networks surround these figures and occasionally intervene between the lens and the person to provide a sense of depth, transparency, and even optical illusion. The photography often reduces the gallery visitors to over or underexposed silhouettes, frequently blurring their edges to indicate perambulation. Did I just go through two? Yeah, okay. So this is one, and I'm going to talk about these very, very faint ghosts right over there. These photographs exaggerate exposures and prolong shutter speeds, turning specific individuals into anonymous bodies and divorcing the camera from its expectation of documentary fidelity. This strategy emphasizes affective experience. Even in the documentary photograph, the bodies themselves become shadows rather than identity-driven figures. In this slide, for example, the motion blur trapped by the photographic record turns bodies into near transparencies themselves, as can be seen in the ghost-like shadows that surround the two figures on the left. Those shadows of bodies mimic the shadows in the room and even the transparency of the fibrous networks. Okay. In this figure, we observe that the same transience performed by these mobile spectators is mirrored in the very fabric of the installation itself. Shadows from the Reticulárea continue the proliferation of triangle networks, I'm looking right over here, virtually as shadows on the walls. Continued inspection shows that the bodies in the photographs also cast additional shadows. They also reflect mirror images from the shiny floor, creating yet another level of doubling. These photographs illustrate that bodies in this installation open up into shadows, reflections, and movements. This is also a Reticulárea. She's made, obviously, multiple of them. This is from 1975. This is in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Substantial critical attention to the line in Gego's work suggests that it should be interpreted in formal modernist language, often associated with Picasso or González, particularly their drawings in space. For instance, Venezuelan art critic Victor Guedes writes, quote, "Gego's work has generally been defined in terms of the projection of lines in space," end quote. Though he challenges the term because he says, quote, "It conceives of space as an adjectival support for the work," end quote. Gego explains the role of the line. She says, quote, "I discovered the charm of the line in and on a surface, and the nothing between lines, and the sparkling when they cross, when they're interrupted, when they're of different colors or different types," end quote. If we are to understand Gego's Reticulárea as lines in space, as shadows on surfaces, as peripheral and marginal spaces, or even as vectors with nothing in between, how are we to understand space in these works? Is there one kind of space? Or are there multiple kinds of potentially incompatible spatial constructions brought together through these wire networks? To reconsider materiality and space in Gego's work, I advocate not formalist terms, but empirical terms. Guedes proposes a formulation of space in Gego's work that reconceives the space that surrounds the networked structures not as empty voids, but rather as reactivated atmosphere. One effect of this shift is the rematerialization of that space as a real substance. He offers one of the most extensive taxonomies of forms in Gego's work, corresponding to 12 categories, and these categories include fabric, strips, rectangles and squares, bands, suggested forms, twisted bands, agglomerated lines, superimposed screens, chords, spurts, reticuláreas, and derivations. Guedes' catalog of formal motifs in Gego's work remains one of the most exhaustive in the literature, though I wonder about the precision of his terms, and importantly, what motivates this kind of taxonomy. Harkening to an earlier formalist method like those of Velflin, Guedes' formal vocabulary suggests to me a mistaken approach to spatial relationships, akin to the mistaking of kind or identity for instance. To say this another way, Guedes' formal approach indicates that he is interested in restoring materiality to Gego's work. But if we look closely at his method, these categories evidence a commitment to structuralist or formalist morphology more than a pragmatic manifestation of any particular work. So I think he's more interested in his own collection of vocabulary than actually looking at the work in place. So to think through these sculptures on their own terms requires not an abstract catalog of formal typologies, but a rigorous consideration of the works in situ. To do this necessitates a look not only at sculptural forms, but also how the work responds to and changes within the exhibition space. Pérez Oramas argues for a real, radically empirical space in which these works exist. And this return to pragmatics focuses on the actual material conditions of the works in exhibition. Pérez Oramas writes that Gego's work, quote, is not any longer discourse-oriented, end quote, and as a result, it is radically real rather than discursively structured. The work, he says, is deconstructive of kinetic illusions. He continues, quote, that is, unless one thinks that the shadows projected by her work constitute, strictly speaking, the most primitive form of writing, a writing which does not transport us to any other place, stripped of all metaphorical force, shadow which reveals to us the inevitable presence of a body barely mobile within a space, and reveals to us the inevitable hollowness of place, end quote. Though decidedly reminiscent of Derrida's Arch-écriture rather than appealing to the language of Deleuze, Pérez Oramas' claim excitingly insists on the pre-symbolic, pre-metaphoric force of these lines and shadows in space. Within this logic, space differs from place, since the latter gains its symbolic function by being defined through language. Place precipitates from the naming of space through discourse. Gego's work takes the specific place of the gallery and offers a non-discursive exploration as space. This struggle between pre-symbolic space and post-symbolic place proves to be a central feminist strategy that my entire book is really trying to look at. All right. On the right over here is called Conjunto the Charros, which is like a conjunction of streams. Chorro, I'll talk about this, a series of works. It can mean stream, jet, it's translated different ways, from 1971, and this is in a gallery in Caracas. The question of space, I will argue, is not a question of substance, which would be the metaphysics of exhibitory space, but one of ontology as affective experience. That is, space for me is bodies moving through environments or through the installation. Knowledge of space speaks more of one's relative experience and motion within an environment than of that environment's constitution itself. In this sense, my interest follows Amor's invocation of Deleuze and Guattari's book, 1,000 Plateaus, which evidences an experiential analysis of Gego's work as rhizomatic performance. This provides for an interpretation of what she calls an affective materialism that is mutable and transitory. Amor's careful archival research reveals that the German architect Christian Thiel brought the concept of the rhizome to Gego's attention in 1982. Amor further shows, according to research obtained from Gego's archives, that Thiel explicitly discussed Gego's works in terms of Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. While the rhizome remains the dominant motif invoked to describe Gego's work, I will argue herein that Deleuzian diagrams may offer greater leverage for a feminist micropolitics of affect. So now I want to talk about what diagrams are. Amor and Thiel are just two of the many voices that discuss rhizomes in the context of Gego's work, but this formal fixation has caused critics and historians to neglect eminently relevant Deleuzian terms beyond the rhizomatic. Lars Bang-Larsen reviewed Gego, one of her exhibitions, and he too speaks of, quote, the ebbing and flowing through a rhizomatic distribution of connections that erodes hierarchies of frame and composition, end quote. Quizzically, he also advances a contradictory argument, quickly following up his post-structural analysis with a regressive modern judgment. He writes, quote, one could argue, though, that hers is ultimately as utopian a position as the modernist domination of space, end quote. Larsen claims in support that the structure of Gego's space is beyond historical space. But this strictly formalist interpretation overlooks the very differences that might arise by comparing Gego's work to, for instance, the minimalists. That is to say, Gego does not represent a tableau, as he says, on the brink of chaos that mutates between geometry and formlessness. That's what Larsen describes it as. Instead, as Amor indicates, the rhizomatic forms that Gego creates function as real-life connectors, drawing together bodies, objects, spaces, and movements. The works themselves are highly performative rather than representational and transhistoric. That is to say, they don't work by representing information or representing connections, but by literally connecting spaces populated with bodies. The life in these works refers not to representational forms, but to performative structures that enact activities of connection and diversion. If there is anything universal about these works, it is the same universal that Deleuze has been indicted for in multiple critical treatises, the universal unfolding of differentiation and difference. It's a transcendental but not a transcendent experience. To show this action of motion at play in Gego's work, I will refer to those sculptures that directly reference flow. And again, chorro could be understood as flow. Many are called either chorros or streams. And Larson himself even calls these works vertical flows of small steel and aluminum rods. So surely the concept of flow was available to him. While the streams and gushes present as direct gestures in their arrangement of metallic rods, I'm most interested in the way that these sculptures work as machines in the gallery. That is to say, the metallic flows are not self-contained, but rather point outwardly into the real space of the gallery. These seemingly static sculptures require extraordinary movement on the part of art-goers to view the flows from different angles, to follow the rivulets, to negotiate the space around the gushes. The sculptures thus take on a temporal and spatial aspect because they act as connectors, bringing environments, things, and bodies together in a temporary, heterogeneous assemblage. When artworks cause art-going bodies to respond en masse, we must consider this kind of assembled flow to be different from the symbolic experiences that characterizes more symbolic spectacles, let's say like the cinema. This is not to say that the Reticulárea and gushes cannot serve to instigate semiotic events, but instead, one of the most exciting effects that the works has is a physical, pre-symbolic sorting machine for art-going publics. The installations can direct bodies throughout the gallery, and this leads me to move beyond the formal visual structure to ask again, what are these works doing kinetically? That is to say, in Deleuzian terms, they work diagrammatically, causing real changes in the distribution of subjective bodies. I will turn to artist and philosopher Manuel de Landa, who has explored the Deleuzian diagram extensively. I aim to show that art-goers, sculptures, and exhibition area space exists effectively and prior to a symbolic interpretation. And most importantly, none of these items exist a priori, but they work together to imminently self-constitute as an art-going public assemblage. This offers a kind of respite from the state or culturally or institutionally sanctioned symbolic space. In his book, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, philosopher and artist Manuel de Landa explores the term meshwork, a term that he uses often and idiosyncratically, usually in contrast to hierarchy, and bearing strong parallels to Deleuze's opposition of rhizomatic and arboreal structures. De Landa doesn't really offer a precise discussion of the distinction between a network and a meshwork. He seems to use the two terms interchangeably at times, and elsewhere he suggests that the network might be a subset of meshwork. So I interpret meshwork through English etymology, which refers simultaneously to the interstitial spaces between the fibers as much as to the fibers themselves. Thus, I interpret de Landa's meshwork theory as suggesting a holistic treatment of mesh structures that do not break down into a binary of positive threads and negative interstices. Similar to my argument for Gego's installations, de Landa writes that meshwork can function both metaphorically and literally. De Landa writes that the, quote, common physical processes behind the formation of meshworks and hierarchies cannot be fully captured through linguistic representations alone. We need to employ something along the lines of engineering diagrams to specify them, end quote. It is in this sense of the diagram that I'm going to turn to explaining the function of Gego's environmental constructions. All right, there's a GIF. I hope nobody has a fit from this. DeLanda offers a vivid example to show language that works both metaphorically and literally. He looks at the phrase, "a hurricane is a steam motor," and he suggests that not only does this phrase work by analogy, but also quite literally, since hurricanes, quote, "embody the same diagram used by engineers to build steam motors," end quote. DeLanda considers a variety of examples where abstract diagrams perform real operations, returning to the primary example that Deleuze and Guattari offer in discussing stratification of sedimentary rock. Okay, so now we're going to do quick natural science. Remembering, rivers work for both DeLanda and, of course, Deleuze and Guattari diagrammatically. And they mean that rivers sort the sizes and shapes of pebbles and stones. This is the first articulation of stratification. And then, when those sorted pieces are pushed together, they coalesce in a secondary process that makes them, usually through heat and pressure, become sedimentary rock. So first there's a sorting mechanism, and next there's a kind of concretization. DeLanda shows that Deleuze and Guattari describe this process as the abstract machine of stratification. And indeed, the difference they draw between diagrams and abstract machines remains pretty convoluted. So for my purposes, I'm going to interpret the diagram somewhat simplistically in the context of a post-structural, or maybe more accurately, Deleuze's anti-structural project. By that, I'm referring to Deleuze's long-standing attack on structures as giving precedence to an a priori law rather than studying the pragmatic instance of phenomena. All right. So to visualize this distinction that I'm trying to draw, let's consider this image over here in which school children play in and around Gego's Reticulárea. A structuralist might analyze this scene by attending to patterns of play. How do the children interact in a given environment? What is the structure of their engagement? What repeated categories of play do they perform, and so on. The diagram, which DeLanda importantly reminds us is not necessarily visual, differs from structure in critical ways. First, structuralists observe instances of behavior, speech, and language to induce the existence of underlying structures. But then they use these structures to deduce and confirm their existence by looking at other instances, which amounts to a kind of circular logic. Deleuze contrasts this with pragmatics. Following Deleuze, I understand pragmatics to hold that the way a given sign is deployed constitutes its meaning, rather than meaning arising from any underlying structure. For instance, the children in Gego's Reticulárea do not take an overarching structure of play and apply it. Instead, play spontaneously erupts because of the particular configurations and circumstances of the room, the conditions of their bodies, their affects, their dispositions. A diagram describes the ways that they move, in particular, the ways that their play congeals around a core that is not an a priori structure, but a self-determining relationality. Diagrams offer a way of thinking through problems that structuralists have approached, but without assuming an a priori structure. Instead, they attend to configurations that self-constitute. This distinction between a diagram and a structure enables Deleuze to think through a transcendental but not a transcendent explanation for processes that move from pure fluidity and molecularity to stasis. DeLanda offers a vivid example that relates to the image that we're looking at of Gego's work, social stratification, as a kind of diagram. He describes a process in which symbolic stratification follows the literal stratification of bodies. Quote, "We talk of social strata whenever a given society presents a variety of differentiated roles to which individuals are denied equal access. And when a subset of those roles, to which the ruling elite alone has access, involves the control of key energy and material resources. While role differentiation may be a spontaneous effect of an intensification in the flow of energy through society, the sorting of those roles into ranks on a scale of prestige involves specific group dynamics," end quote. DeLanda's discussion of social stratification offers an aggregate image consistent with Althusser's analysis of interpretation, which we'll go over in the next critical studies reading groups. That is to say, Althusser provided a significant advancement in the way we understand subject formation as mutually constituting. In Althusser's famous example, a police officer hails a pedestrian, but the officer's authority is constituted mutually as the walker responds, acknowledging both the officer's power and the pedestrian's status as a subject of the state. That is to say, a diagrammatic operation interpolates both parties in their respective subject positions. At the social level, and much closer to the image of sedimentary rock, many pre-subjective bodies sort together. The dynamic forces that enable this are both internal and external, but not a priori. This sorting of bodies describes the first articulation of that social stratification. When those roles, as DeLanda calls them, solidify, we witness the second articulation as the social diagram creates subject functions of some permanence. Now, in truth, diagrams do not yield permanence, and I insist that by creating these diagrammatic sculptures, Gego reminds us of the fluidity of most diagrammatic operations. That is, while diagrams can stratify social structures, most of the resulting strata can also be molecularized. The potential to molecularize does not necessarily reverse the action of a diagram, but it does counteract the assumed stasis we see after the second articulation. So let's apply this to the Reticulárea. Recall Amor's argument that the sculpture pulls in the peripheries of the gallery and by extension challenges the understanding of the organization of Caracas. Gego's installation functions diagrammatically not because they resemble engineering diagrams, but because they work as machines of redistribution and change. Museums are highly charged, behaviorally stratified spaces. As museologist Carol Armstrong has demonstrated, museums regulate ritualistic action premised on class-based behavior, in which institutions inculcate art viewers into a relationship with artworks premised on staid, individualistic, and even platonic reverie, but rarely wild play in a museum. The Reticulárea work diagrammatically to counteract this class-based stratification, de-stratifying those presumably timeless relationships cultured artgoers forge with artworks. Instead, they reticulate. They divide what would otherwise be socially stratified rules for beholding art. They break static art-going roles up into parts, and once those roles are molecularized, we see the emergence of spontaneous, joyful play. Moreover, the wire networks reticulate so that subjectivities, rather than subjects, forge new, radically emergent, continually changing relationships to themselves, to one another, and to the environment. The Reticulárea, the Charros, and similar environmental pieces serve as reticulation and flow diagrams, not to illustrate a structural relationship, but to actualize and de-stratify subjects within a complex field. As DeLanda himself says parenthetically, and all this without metaphor. So that's the end of this part, but I'll give you a little teaser for the Matrixial. So I'm then, in this final chapter, going to move from using the diagram to talk about what this work is doing to looking at the Matrixial, which again is this, we've talked a little bit maybe about the Lacanian subject position. The Lacanian position requires the creation of the self by the other. You need the other/mother in order to create the self. This is obviously premised on all sorts of sexist, if they're just linguistic, still problematic stances. So Étanger takes a different idea, and she says, well, every human being has at one point been inside a womb, and she imagines that instead of having to deal with the differentiation, other and self, what about a subject position that's very archaic, that actually is all about coexistence without differentiation. So two or more co-emerge without that other self dichotomy. And so, and she uses the word matrix specifically because the word matrix has in its etymology similar links to the uterus. So I look at Janet Eckelman's work and kind of wrap up my book by talking about how these affective feminist subjectivities for me are all about coexistence and co-emergence rather than kind of self-other dichotomies. And that's not only a very dangerous place to be, but also a really exciting political place to be. So with that, thank you very much. I'd love to see if there's some discussion. I appreciate it. Please.
Please pardon me if I misheard this. I think there was a part where we were talking about Gego's art, that it's not a spectacle, but it's been referred to as art performative. Can you elaborate?
Sure. So I was thinking about the spectacle that was like Guy Debord, or spectacles being these moments where there's groups of people looking at something. So one of the most famous instances of spectacles, well, this is a spectacle, right? But movies are spectacles. So we're a group of people in mass functioning to look at something. And cinema, I was talking about, cinema is generally and exceptionally symbolic, right? Everything about cinema, with the exception of maybe very, very avant-garde structural cinema, is always about human beings. So everything's very, very symbolic. So it wasn't that I was suggesting that there was another kind of spectacle, but that the kind of spectacle that you can have with these sculptures first could be effective rather than symbolic. And so when it's effective, and again, I'm using the term affect to describe your emotions before you can name them. So this is that half second before you can put a language to say, I'm feeling this. So it's not yet cognitive. It's very physical and embodied, and it affects your body, right? But it's not yet put into these terms. So in that moment then, when we have people in kind of group-based spectacles, and I'll flip back to a Gego one, there's the potential for a kind of group spectatorship before we have the symbolic. And if we don't yet have the symbolic, then we don't have self and other yet. Then we still have co-emergence and the potential of not quite an ethic. You can't have an ethics of affect, but you can have ethical repercussions from realizing our interdependence. And that's where I was trying to go. Thank you. Yeah? Sure. I'll keep those on because I love this picture. Yeah, please. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Uh-huh. Great. So you've got a lot of interesting things. One of the things I'm hearing is that maybe the way that kids can experience, in this case, joy, might be different from the way an adult might experience it. And I would say that adults, everyone experiences affect. The difference is we usually use reason to convert what is a non-language-based experience into something that's either rational or irrational. So we might have the same, we always are having affective experiences, and language can even give us affective experiences. But I think the piece that I'm interested in is the suspension of language, so that we can really attune to that experience. And so I guess one of the things I haven't seen a lot of her work in public, but I did get to see the compilation of particularly, like, it was a show at MoMA where a small piece was mounted. And I did notice that adults are more aware of their body's interactions, right? So even if later on they go and they talk about it, at least at some moment they realize that they are directly changing the exhibition viewing, particularly when there's shadows and your shadow kind of interferes with someone else's shadow. So it isn't that I'm arguing that affect is a wonderful thing. I spend a lot of time actually showing where affect is all about vulnerability and there's danger. And a lot of times, affect is about desire. And sometimes we desire things that we shouldn't be desiring. We consume things, right? We eat things. So there's all sorts of things that come out of affect that are not necessarily nice for the other party. But the piece that I am interested in is, can we use affect to rediscover a kind of commonality that is not about my role and your role and this role, but can we recognize that at a pre-linguistic level, we all are these assemblages that are much more open and vulnerable? Does that make sense? So I love that thought, and we do need some more adult kind of activities that are more kind of joyful, right, in the museum. Please. Yeah. Great. Perfect. Yeah. Ah. Yeah. Great. 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 Okay, I'll take them one at a time if that's okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's really great. And they are confusing, and they're still confusing to me. And then when you read them by other theorists, every theorist has his or her own interpretation of what they mean. So it gets even more compounded. But Deleuze and Guattari kind of give you permission to pick it up and run with it. So that's what I'm doing. So let's go to the stratification part. So in, let's say, a kind of a usual museum, right? Let's imagine that we're joining a docent tour, right? So we're walking into a big museum. We sort ourselves. We self-sort with a bunch of people who also want to go on this tour. So that's the first articulation of stratification. We get ourselves together. Let's imagine this tour is going great, and we just agree with absolutely everything that docent is saying, and we leave that place with a solid new narrative of whatever we just saw, and we're stuck with it. That would be the kind of second layer of stratification. So that's when what was fluid and moving was grouped, and then we kind of moved towards stasis with this new narrative. Does that make sense? So far, so good. So for me, molecularization means breaking that back. It doesn't mean that you can go backwards in time to that point where we were open, but it might mean that some other kind of activity will loosen the stasis you think you had, right? So I actually think that in this case, and that's the Delanda's piece, is yes, they work like metaphorically, but they actually work in a real way to physically, like, so when you see people having to negotiate sculpture, it's weird to see it, especially when there are kids, and I've been able to see some work with kids, because they don't always observe the kind of stasis that we're supposed to. So I do think that the work quite literally also molecularizes. The way we move our bodies changes. The way that we group in the same room changes. When you have transparencies like this, you start having interactions with people you never would have interacted because there's this meshwork between you. And so all these interesting spontaneous things happen because of the work. It's literally acting to break apart that kind of very uniform way that we're supposed to enter a museum. Does that kind of address it? Thank you. I appreciate that. Great. Thank you. Yeah, please. Great. Yeah, that's great. And I deal with shadows like throughout the book in different ways, and they do different things in different points. But I think there are two ways I'm looking at shadows. One shadow is very iconic, right? You can look at a shadow of Peter Pan and you know it points to Peter Pan. Does that, right? Okay. And so I'm thinking about that as a symbolic shadow. But then I think there are some shadows that you're unaware of its symbolic part. You're unaware because maybe it's blurred, maybe there are multiple overlapping shadows at once. So the shadows, in this case to me, talk about connective fields, but they don't necessarily index one kind of light source or one object. So for me, these open shadows are a kind of a metaphor, but they're also quite literal in that they're these open, potentially pre-symbolic forms. So I think that shadows can function in both ways. And actually, this is important for the stratification. Deleuze, and he talks about all sorts of kind of binaries, But he never wants you to believe that these binaries are static, that in fact, open and closed shadows are more of a spectrum, that stasis and flux are actually also not on a seesaw so much as on a spectrum, and they can coexist. So the shadows that I'm most interested in here are the ones where your bodies, where the things in the rooms, where the museum lights, where everything starts folding in on itself, and you stop seeing them as indexes of intervening bodies, and you start seeing them as their own kind of meshes. In the book, I have another piece where I look at, Gego makes these beautiful drawings. She calls them drawings without paper. And what I'm interested in there is looking at the materials, but then the shadows when they cast, because they're meant to be lit, flatten everything that was striated. And so they create this flattening effect that changes the indexical assumption of a shadow. That's the part where that confusion of shadows I think is really exciting for me. Yeah. Thank you. That's great. Oh, I have two. Great. Should we go front and then back? Does that work? Great.
This might sound like a very large question, but
Great.
what the greater extent of your book is, and then maybe how that fits in with like your personal mission as a thinker. That's like a huge question.
That's great. Okay. We'll have drinks afterwards, and then we'll I think, so the book itself is looking at fiber art and craft, and I'm using those not in very specific taxonomies, but I'm really looking at case studies of all women artists, mostly from the US, but some from Latin America, who are using fiber in ways that I think are ultimately connecting. And while they are symbolic, and I in no way think we can stop symbolic struggle, but I think that we experience a lot of struggle that is not symbolic, right? Pain is first and foremost an affective response. Then when we use words to describe it, it becomes symbolic, right? So I'm really interested in how I think a bunch of artists are using these rhizomatic forms, anti-hierarchical forms, forms that are all about connectivity, as a way of challenging separateness, and specifically like ways of bringing people together as assemblages to kind of return us to that experience before the symbolic. So that's what the book is about kind of generally. The bigger piece for me right now, so the personal disclosure, I meditate a lot and I'm a Zen practitioner, so I'm very interested in this moment that we oftentimes skip over, but we actually live in, right, which is the present moment. And I think a lot about we are these bodies that are constantly having affective experiences throughout the day, but then we use language, and that language converts those experiences into something else. It allows us to project, right? So when I drive, first I feel like road rage, but then I say, you're the asshole, right? So I'm able to take that from me and put it outside of me, right? So that's a symbolic gesture. When you're able to take something, turn it into language, and put it outside, you suddenly see this division. And I think that what a lot of the feminists that I'm looking at specifically here are interested in doing is to show that while that definitely exists, there are also these other moments where we are all fields in these co-vulnerable and co-joyous kind of assemblages. And so for me, that's a political act. So all of my work is always political. And I'm particularly interested in trying to ask, why has the literature on these artists been so specific? Why has it been so gendered? Why has it been so reductive? And for me, it has to do with power and seeing that this work is at the vanguard of kind of really the Deleuzian century, rather than kind of recuperating the history in another way. I want to see this as offering something brand new that hasn't been available. So that's my kind of long-term trajectory. And then the other long-term is bodies. Like I really am very interested in bodies in a kind of anarchic way rather than a systematic way. So how can we desystematize bodies and remind us that these are big holistic organisms, right? Thank you. Yeah, please, Lauren.
So you talked about materialism, materiality,
Yeah.
and it being like an invalid form of art
Ah.
at the time, and I was just wondering how that translated or is like relevant, or if it is like today, maybe 60 years later.
Yeah.
Because it seems like a pretty like common statement today. It's like that it is kind of like a reasonable like decision.
Okay. I think that's great. And I think there's probably a lot going on in the discussion. So I'm interested, I was looking at a particular critic who was trying to come up with like typologies that he saw over and over, right? So that would be a kind of earlier formalism where you're looking for categories of, form. So far, so good. The criticism that I had for him was that even though this kind of formalism looks like it's really caring about the material, which I admire, I'm arguing that a lot of times people who have these divisions are more attached to the divisions than actually looking at what's in front of them. So I'm worried about where taxonomies actually take precedence over the work itself. So for example, I showed you that really weird image with the Museum of Houston, right, where they backlit, it was black, and the stainless steel wire was the kind of white, right? The exact same form under different conditions is completely different, right? So for me, if you use these categories, you can easily forget that it isn't a kind of transcendent category that's important. What's important is the instance of mounting it, which is why one work mounted this way can be a totally different work from the other way. So in no way am I discounting what I would kind of call neoformalism, which would be a resuscitation of that. But I do have a problem when the categories are given precedence over the particular, if that makes sense. So for me, I'm all about rematerializing. And for me, affect is a way of rematerializing our bodily experience when usually we psychoanalytically split it, right? We take our emotions and we turn it into some sort of language. So I'm really into materiality and new kinds of materialism. But I'm not into using the categories as the origin of that. I'm into experiencing the work in sight and recognizing that the exact same piece in a different set of circumstances is a totally different piece, if that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Thinkers who actually can engage and trust affect or the affective quality within their work, because I find that very often very much a contradiction in education.
That's great, and it kind of gets at an earlier question of like my mission, right? How do I see my job? And I guess I think because I started from a making position and then later defected, I've always seen the talking of art as a community event. And I often find actually, and maybe this is a criticism of the way that we train makers, is that we train them to be the authorities, the verbal authorities on their work. And I guess maybe it's for job security that I want critics to be able to talk about work too. And when they talk about it, they are creating language that goes onto the surface, but it isn't the work. And that's the crucial part. Everything that I described is a kind of my own creative endeavor, right? So I think that there was a time when that relationship between critics and artists was just assumed. You would just go, have an absinthe together, and talk about it, right? This was just assumed that you were in these communities. So for me, I definitely think artists need to be proactive in giving certain languages to shape the discourses that will eventually stick to their works. But I do see them as potentially different. I do think that the whole experience of affect while making is an essential part, and that we can only kind of guess at what's going on there. And then the language offers a different kind of valence to the work. It allows it to circulate through language. But I firmly believe in what Habermas calls weak autonomy of art. So I do believe that art impacts you before language colonizes it. But what I do then is I don't really explain the work, I affix my own narrative to it, and hopefully there'll be plenty of other narratives that'll spin around it. So for me, I'd love to see less pressure in knowing what your work is doing and more room for realizing that this kind of criticism is just another creative event, but it's a different creative event. Yeah, I appreciate that. I hope that it kind of dealt with it a little bit. Great. Well, Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you showing up. Have a great night.